Imagine this. A silent chapel, flickering candlelight. The scent of beeswax and damp stone. A single woman kneels before the tabernacle, her hands folded, her face illuminated by trembling gold. It is Saint Teresa of Ávila. The year is 1559. Outside, Spain burns with religious fervor. Inside, Teresa burns with something far more dangerous. A desire for God so consuming that it could destroy her if misdirected. She closes her eyes, her heart filled with sweetness, and suddenly a vision floods her mind. A light, dazzling and tender. A voice that whispers words of love. Her soul trembles. She thinks it is the Lord. But when the light fades, she feels only confusion, a strange pride, a subtle chill in her heart. Later she will write, "I understood then how easily the enemy can disguise himself as an angel of light. He flatters the soul with sweetness so that it may drink poison thinking it honey." This is how Saint Teresa learned her first great lesson of prayer. That not every light that visits the soul comes from heaven. She discovered that the devil rarely tempts advanced souls with obvious sin. He has more elegant methods. He takes the language of grace, tears, visions, warmth, zeal, and he mimics it so perfectly that even holy people rejoice while quietly drifting away from God. Teresa saw it in her own life. When she first began to pray deeply, her experiences were intense. She wept, trembled, felt ecstasies that left her breathless. The nuns around her whispered, "She is blessed." But she began to notice that these moments didn't always leave her humbler or kinder. Sometimes they left her restless, proud, eager to talk about her spiritual experiences. And then came the question that changed her forever. Was I seeking God? Or was I seeking myself through God? That question, she realized, is the dividing line between true prayer and spiritual illusion. The enemy of souls, she warned, doesn't mind if you pray. As long as your prayer keeps you looking at yourself. He'll happily give you tears, visions, even miracles. If it keeps you from humility, obedience, and charity. He can imitate light but never love. That is why Teresa insisted that discernment is the foundation of every prayer life. Because when the soul mistakes emotion for grace, inspiration for obedience, or ecstasy for union, it begins to worship its own feelings instead of the living God. She once wrote, "The devil fears nothing so much as humble clarity. For when the soul sees itself truly, he has nowhere to hide." Her words are not meant to frighten but to awaken us. Most of us think temptation only wears the mask of sin. Teresa discovered that it often wears the mask of holiness, a dangerous counterfeit that comforts our pride while starving our love. So tonight, we walk with her through the narrow corridor between light and shadow, where prayer becomes the battleground of the soul. We will uncover the 5 spiritual counterfeits that Saint Teresa warned about. Illusions so subtle they can deceive even the devout. You will learn how she unmasked them, how she learned to recognize the voice of self disguised as the voice of God, and how she found her way back to the simplicity of pure love. Because in the end, Teresa discovered something extraordinary. The holiest moments in prayer are not those filled with visions and tears, but those when the soul kneels in silence, stripped of comfort, and still whispers, "Thy will be done." So take a breath. Let your heart grow quiet. And as we begin this journey with Saint Teresa, ask yourself one question. Have I been seeking God, or the feeling of finding Him? Because the answer to that question may decide whether your prayer leads you to heaven, or only back to yourself. Have you ever prayed with such intensity that your heart felt ready to burst? Tears streamed down your face. You felt warmth, peace, even a sense of being embraced by something greater than yourself. And when it ended, you thought, surely this is God. Surely I have touched heaven. Saint Teresa knew that feeling well. In her early years of prayer, she experienced powerful emotions, waves of tenderness, sudden sobs, overwhelming love. She thought these were the signs of divine favor. But later, after years of testing and trial, she wrote, "I learned that not all sweetness is divine. Sometimes the soul tastes its own devotion, not God's presence." Teresa discovered that emotion, though beautiful, can become a substitute for grace. The soul begins to chase feelings instead of faith, ecstasy instead of endurance, warmth instead of will. And the devil, she warned, delights in this confusion, because it keeps the soul circling around itself, never moving toward true surrender. Listen carefully to her words. When prayer leaves the soul restless or proud, it was not from the Spirit of God. The divine touch always humbles and brings peace. True consolation, Teresa explains, doesn't intoxicate, it simplifies. It doesn't make you speak of your experience, it makes you silent in awe. It doesn't draw attention to you, it makes you disappear into love. So how do you recognize when emotion has crossed the line from holy to human? Teresa gives us 3 signs. First, true grace leads to humility. After authentic prayer, you do not feel larger, you feel smaller, like a child who has glimpsed how vast God truly is. If your emotion leaves you secretly pleased with yourself, it is not grace. It is vanity in disguise. Second, true grace leaves peace, not craving. When prayer ends, divine union leaves a quiet joy that lingers in the soul. False ecstasy, on the other hand, fades quickly and leaves you hungry for more. You begin to chase experiences the way an addict chases euphoria, forgetting that love is proven in perseverance, not intensity. Third, true grace makes you love others more. Teresa insisted that no mystical experience is genuine if it does not increase charity. If you leave prayer impatient, critical, or withdrawn from others, you may have been talking to your own reflection, not to God. She knew this trap firsthand. At one point in her life, she confessed to enjoying her hours of prayer more than her service to the sisters. She would feel lifted in ecstasy, only to return to the community annoyed by noise or interruptions. And that is when she realized, I loved prayer but not the cross. I loved sweetness but not sacrifice. And so I loved myself in the name of God. After that discovery, she begged the Lord to teach her the difference between divine love and self-love. He answered her not with more feelings but with silence. For months, her prayer became dry, empty, and painful. But that dryness purified her. She learned to love God not for the comfort He gave but for who He is. In time she would write, "The greatest grace is to pray without consolation and still believe." So when you next kneel and tears begin to fall, do not fear them, but do not trust them blindly. Ask yourself, do these tears make me more patient? Do they draw me to obedience, humility, and service? Do they make me love the one who hides his face as much as the one who reveals it? If they do, rejoice, you have touched true grace. If they do not despair. Even false sweetness can become holy when it teaches you discernment. Saint Teresa concluded this warning with a line worth memorizing. In prayer, love must prove itself not by how it feels, but by how it obeys. Emotion is the blossom of devotion, but love is the fruit. Blossoms are beautiful, but they do not last. The fruit of prayer is what remains when all sweetness has fallen away: humility, peace, and love. And that is how the soul learns to walk from illusion into truth. There is a moment in the life of every soul that prays sincerely when a voice arises from within. It feels powerful, luminous, certain. It tells you what to do, whom to trust, where to go. You feel inspired, even commanded, and you whisper to yourself, God has spoken to me. But Saint Teresa of Ávila would pause you right there. Because she knew that not every inner voice belongs to heaven. Sometimes, she said, it is simply the echo of our own desires dressed in divine language. And sometimes, it is something darker, an imitation of truth that flatters rather than sanctifies. In her autobiography, The Life, Teresa describes how easily she was deceived in her early years of prayer. She would hear words in her heart that urged her to take certain actions, to speak, to write, to lead. And these messages often felt radiant, infused with what she thought was grace. But later, through the discernment of her confessor, she discovered that the voice she trusted so completely was often her own zeal speaking louder than the quiet whisper of God. She confessed, the Lord speaks gently, the devil and the imagination speak loudly. Think about that. God's voice never demands attention. It never flatters. It never rushes. Comes like a breath, not a shout. Comes in peace, not in pressure. The false voice, whether from pride, fear, or the enemy, does the opposite. It urges immediate action. It feeds your sense of importance. It whispers, you have been chosen. Others will not understand you. Obey only this inspiration. Saint Teresa warned her nuns that such private certainty can be the most dangerous form of pride, because it hides beneath the mask of obedience to God. The soul that trusts its own understanding without counsel, she wrote, walks with a blindfold even in daylight. She learned this lesson through humiliation. Once, after receiving what she believed was a divine instruction to found a new convent, she announced her plans to her confessor, expecting approval. Instead, he forbade her to act. Her heart broke. She was convinced that obedience would mean disobeying God himself. But she obeyed anyway, and later she discovered that the timing of her inspiration had been wrong. What she thought was revelation was only her own impatience disguised as holiness. It was that moment, she said, that taught her the difference between God's voice and her own. God's commands are confirmed by peace, she wrote, and by the obedience they inspire, not by the disturbance they cause. So how do we recognize this counterfeit voice in our own prayer? Teresa gives 3 tests, 3 questions every soul must ask when an interior word arises. First, does this voice lead me to obedience or isolation? The true voice of God never separates you from the church, from your spiritual director, or from the counsel of wise and holy friends. The false voice thrives in secrecy. It makes you believe that your relationship with God exempts you from guidance. Second, does it bring peace or agitation? When the Lord speaks, his words settle the soul like calm water after a storm. When the self speaks, there is tension, an urgency to act, to prove, to convince. If you feel restless and anxious to execute a divine idea, pause. Heaven does not hurry. Third, does it produce humility or importance? When God gives a mission, it breaks the heart with gratitude. When the self invents one, it swells the ego with pride. One leaves you wanting to serve, the other leaves you wanting to be seen. Teresa's confessor once told her, "If the Lord truly speaks to you, he will also speak through obedience." She never forgot those words. And so, for the rest of her life, every inspiration she received was tested through submission. If her confessor approved, she moved forward. If he doubted, she waited. And again, heaven rewarded her patience. In time, Teresa learned that God's greatest voice is silence. That he speaks not in words but in will. In the quiet conviction that remains after prayer, not in the fireworks that burst during it. She wrote, "The voice of God leaves the soul free to obey. The voice of self leaves the soul compelled to act." So when a sudden inspiration stirs your heart, resist the temptation to run. Sit with it. Test it. Pray over it. Seek counsel. If it is from God, it will remain gentle yet firm. If it is from you, it will wither in the light of humility. Saint Teresa's wisdom still applies in our world of instant impulses and loud opinions. Not every inner certainty is divine. And sometimes the holiest act you can perform is to pause. To wait until peace confirms what emotion proposes. Because the God who truly speaks to the heart never shouts over silence. There is a trap so subtle, so pleasing to the soul, that even saints have stumbled into it. It doesn't come wrapped in temptation or pleasure or sin. It comes disguised as virtue. It comes when prayer begins to feel fruitful, when you seem to understand the ways of God. When others begin to look at you as an example of holiness. It is the most refined poison in the spiritual life, pride disguised as progress. Saint Teresa of Ávila knew this poison intimately. In her early years as a Carmelite nun, she was admired for her eloquence, her intelligence, her grace. Visitors sought her counsel, priests admired her insight. And she began, almost without realizing it, to enjoy her own reputation for holiness. She later confessed, "I wanted to be thought devout, but I did not yet wish to be humble." And that, she said, was the root of her spiritual blindness. She would spend hours in prayer, seeking ecstasy and consolation. But the moment her attention turned inward, her progress stopped. She wrote, "Pride is a thief that enters through the door of prayer and steals the treasure before the soul even knows it possessed it." Have you ever felt secretly proud of your devotion? Have you thought, "I pray more than others. I am closer to God because I feel him more deeply"? If so, Saint Teresa would not scold you. She would smile gently and say, "You are standing where I once stood." The danger of spiritual pride, she warns, is that it blinds you with your own light. You begin to measure holiness by the intensity of your prayer, by your knowledge of Scripture, by your purity of life. And little by little, you become the standard instead of the student. But Teresa reminds us, true holiness is invisible even to the one who possesses it. She said, "The holiest souls often think themselves the worst, for humility opens the eyes to all that remains to be done." To cure herself of this pride, God gave Teresa a strange medicine, dryness. After years of sweetness, her prayer suddenly became cold, empty, exhausting. No tears, no joy, no visions, only silence. She thought she had offended God. But later she realized it was an act of mercy. He withdrew his light, she wrote, so that I might see the darkness within myself. That darkness became her teacher. Through it she learned to love God not for his consolations, but for his will. She called this painful purification the dark grace of humility. She explained that when God hides himself, it is never rejection. It is correction. It is the moment when he asks, "Will you still love me when I give you nothing to feel?" For Teresa, that was the true test of prayer. When the soul can love God in dryness, it has learned to love him in truth. The proud soul seeks emotion as proof. The humble soul seeks obedience as proof. The proud soul needs to be noticed, even by heaven. The humble soul is content to be unseen, as long as God sees. One of her most striking confessions appears in the interior castle. She writes, "I once thought I was walking close to heaven because I was often in rapture. Now I know I was walking closer when I simply obeyed without joy." In other words, holiness is not measured by how high your soul can fly in prayer, but by how deeply it can bow in humility. So how can we guard ourselves from this subtle counterfeit, the pride that hides in piety? Teresa offers 3 remedies. First, remember your nothingness often. She advised her sisters to speak to God as beggars before the king. For gratitude protects the soul from vanity. Second, love correction. If you feel wounded when someone questions your intentions, take it as a gift. Pride dies quickest when it is contradicted. Third, serve in secret. Do good where no one can see you. The more you hide your virtues from human eyes, the safer they are from corruption. Teresa's own humility grew from humiliation. She was once accused by church officials of delusion. Her visions dismissed as hysteria. For months she was forbidden to speak of her experiences. She obeyed in silence. And in that silence she found her freedom. "Obedience," she wrote, "is the axe that cuts down the root of pride." Years later she would say that those painful months were among the happiest of her life, because in losing her reputation she found her soul. Perhaps that is the hidden meaning of her teaching. That God allows the fall of your image so that your heart may rise. So if your prayer life has become dry, if your once fiery devotion feels dim, don't panic. You may be standing in the school of humility, the very classroom where saints are made. Because as Saint Teresa teaches us, the way up to God is always down, down through humility, down through obedience, down through love. And when the soul learns that lesson, no deception can touch it, because there is nothing left in it for pride to grasp. There is a kind of fire that looks holy but burns the wrong things. It glows with passion, it speaks with conviction, it prays loudly and works tirelessly. Yet, as Saint Teresa of Ávila discovered, this fire does not warm, it scorches. It is the flame of false zeal, a devotion that fights for truth but forgets love. She saw it often among the devout. Souls who prayed daily, fasted often, corrected others sharply, and believed that their intensity proved their holiness. But Teresa saw something missing in their eyes: gentleness. She wrote, "There are souls who seem on fire for God but burn everyone around them." False zeal, she explained, begins as a pure desire for holiness, but it becomes corrupted when love is replaced by judgment. It's when the heart grows hot for truth but cold toward people. When you defend God's honor but wound his children. Teresa understood this temptation deeply because she had fallen into it herself. During her early reforms of the Carmelite order, she was convinced that strict discipline was the only way to please God. She demanded silence, austerity, perfection. And when her sisters failed, she felt righteous anger. But then one night in prayer she heard a quiet rebuke within her soul. "Teresa, I am not served by severity but by love." She wept. She realized that her zeal, though clothed in virtue, had begun to crush the very souls she wanted to sanctify. From that moment her tone changed. She still taught discipline, but now it was tempered by tenderness. She said, "Correction without love is a hammer that builds nothing." So how can we tell when our zeal has turned false? Teresa gives us signs, and they are piercingly clear. First, when your prayer leaves you angry more than merciful. If you leave your time with God ready to argue, to judge, to correct, something in your prayer has gone wrong. Authentic prayer softens the heart. It makes you ache for souls, not attack them. Second, when you feel joy at others' failures or discomfort at their success. Teresa called this the devil's jealousy disguised as piety. if you secretly rejoice when someone holier than you stumbles, or if you resent when another receives praise for virtue, it means your zeal has turned inward, serving pride, not God. Third, when truth becomes more important than charity. Teresa was never afraid to correct error, but she always reminded her nuns that the highest truth is love itself. To defend truth without love, she wrote, is to betray both. This kind of false zeal can even appear in religious leaders, people who work tirelessly for the kingdom, but lose compassion in the process. They measure others by their rules instead of by mercy. Teresa warned, "It is not the strictness of our life that saves us, but the largeness of our love." She told her sisters that true zeal is recognized not by its noise but by its fruit. Humility, patience, and kindness. When zeal leads to bitterness, it has already been poisoned. To illustrate this, Teresa told a story about one of her nuns. A woman fervent in discipline, sharp in judgment, and tireless in work. Everyone admired her. But one day Teresa noticed the other sisters avoiding her. They feared her corrections more than they felt her love. So Teresa called her aside and said, "My daughter, you have built many walls but no doors. Holiness must let others in." The nun wept. And so did Teresa. Because she knew that her words were also for herself. In time, Teresa would come to define holiness not by intensity but by gentleness. "A single act of patience," she wrote, "is worth more than 1,000 acts of zeal without love. True zeal is cruciform, it burns itself rather than others. It is the flame of Christ who defended truth by dying for his enemies rather than destroying them. It is a fire that warms, not wounds. If you feel anger rising in your soul over the sins of the world, pause before you speak. Ask yourself, am I moved by love or by pride? Would I correct this person if no one could see me doing it? If the answer is no, then your zeal needs purifying." Saint Teresa's advice was simple but profound. Be gentle even when you must be firm. Speak truth, but let your voice carry compassion, for the devil cannot imitate love. In her later years, when her reform faced fierce opposition, Teresa responded not with wrath but with peace. She prayed for her accusers, calling them friends of my soul's advancement. She said, "They teach me to suffer for Christ, and so I love them." And perhaps that is the greatest mark of true zeal. To love even those who misunderstand your devotion. To let your fire refine you first before you ever use it to light another soul. Because as Saint Teresa of Ávila reminds us, zeal without love builds walls, zeal with love builds heaven. Every soul that begins to pray deeply eventually faces this temptation, the longing to see something divine. A vision, a sign, a voice. Something undeniable that proves that heaven is near. Saint Teresa of Ávila understood this longing. She too once begged God for signs of his presence. And in his mercy he granted them, dazzling lights, angelic voices, even moments when her body rose from the ground in ecstasy. The world called her blessed. But Teresa called herself in danger. She wrote, "Extraordinary favors are not proof of holiness. They are trials disguised as gifts." In the beginning she was overwhelmed by wonder. She thought that these visions were marks of divine friendship, tokens of her progress. But the more she received them, the more she began to fear them. Because she saw that they could easily awaken pride, not only in herself but in those around her. Visitors came to hear her speak about her visions. Priests wrote to her, asking for details of the apparitions. And though she obeyed their requests, her heart grew uneasy. "I saw that people admired me more for what I experienced than for how I obeyed," she wrote. And that realization pierced her like a sword. She began to pray a dangerous prayer. "Lord, if these visions are not from you, take them away. If they are from you, hide them from my pride." From that day forward, Teresa taught that the desire for the miraculous is a hidden form of spiritual greed. She called it the appetite for wonders. It begins as love for God's beauty, but it quickly becomes addiction to spiritual pleasure. And once the soul begins to crave experiences, it loses its taste for quiet faith. She warned her nuns, "Do not desire to see angels, but to become one through obedience and humility." To understand this, Teresa gives us a profound truth. The devil can imitate visions, lights, and voices, but he cannot imitate peace. He can produce sensations but not sanctity. He can enchant the mind but not change the heart. And so she gave 3 tests for any extraordinary experience. First, does it increase humility? If the experience makes you feel chosen or special, it is not from God. If it makes you feel small, grateful, and unworthy, then it may be divine. Second, does it produce obedience? When God gives a revelation, it always harmonizes with church teaching and leads to submission, not independence. If your experience causes you to act on your own authority, to defy your spiritual guide, or to treat others as less enlightened, it is counterfeit. Third, does it leave lasting peace? Teresa said that true divine encounters leave the soul quiet and steadfast, not excited or anxious. God's presence stills the storm, the enemy's imitation stirs it. Many of her contemporaries misunderstood her caution. They accused her of doubting God's power. But Teresa was not doubting God, she was protecting his purity in the soul. She said, "It is better to walk in the darkness of faith than to mistake illusion for light." One story from her life shows this perfectly. During one of her visions, Teresa saw a radiant being standing near her. It was beautiful, majestic, and spoke words of comfort. But instead of feeling joy, she felt a sharp fear deep within. So she made the sign of the cross. The being vanished instantly, leaving behind a cold emptiness. She later wrote, "The devil flees from the sign of humility as quickly as from the sign of the cross." That experience taught her to test everything, even what appeared heavenly. She no longer sought visions, ecstasies, or voices. She sought only God's will, and that made her holier than any miracle ever could. In her interior castle, Teresa explains why God sometimes allows extraordinary experiences. Not as rewards but as instruments. Sometimes he grants them to strengthen a soul that is weak. Other times he withholds them to strengthen a soul that is proud. Either way, she said, the goal is the same, to lead the soul to pure love unshaken by sense or sight. She called this the prayer of pure faith. A prayer where nothing extraordinary happens, and yet everything within the soul is surrendered. No voices, no visions, no sweetness, only trust. She said, the greatest miracle is to persevere in love when God hides himself. So if you pray and feel nothing, no light, no warmth, no sign, do not be discouraged. You are walking the safest path. Because the closer you come to God, the less he allows your senses to guide you. He invites you to walk by faith alone, to love what you cannot see, and to believe even when your heart feels empty. Saint Teresa ended her reflections on this topic with one of her simplest and most beautiful lines. "Seek not the gifts of God but the God of all gifts." This, she said, is the soul's highest freedom. To need nothing except his will. So when you hear others speak of visions, or when you long for signs of his nearness, remember her counsel. The holiest sign of all is not what appears to your eyes, but what transforms your heart, the quiet hidden change that no one sees but God. Because in the silence where no miracle comes, the greatest miracle may already be taking place. The death of pride, the birth of pure love, and the soul's slow awakening to heaven within. When Saint Teresa of Ávila finished writing The Interior Castle, she laid down her pen and whispered, "All that matters is love. Not visions, not tears, not revelations, only love, patient, humble, quiet love." Because after all her battles, after all her ecstasies and temptations, she discovered that the surest way to God was not through rapture or extraordinary grace, but through simplicity, through a heart that seeks him for his own sake. Even when there is nothing to feel or see. The 5 spiritual counterfeits she warned us about. Emotional ecstasy mistaken for union. The voice of self disguised as God's will. Pride wearing the mask of progress. Zeal without love. And the craving for miracles. Are not the sins of the wicked. They are the shadows that appear only when the light of devotion begins to burn. They are the tests of those who truly pray. So if you recognize yourself in any of these warnings, do not despair. It means your soul is awake, alive, and loved enough for heaven to refine it. Teresa said, God leads each soul by the path it most fears, because there he can make it most humble. The cure for all deception is not suspicion. It is humility. The soul that stays small will never be lost. The heart that bows low cannot fall far. And even if it does, the arms of mercy are very close to the ground. Let Teresa's voice echo now through the centuries. The devil can imitate everything but peace. When you feel true peace, do not doubt, you are near your God. So tonight, as you close your eyes in prayer, don't strive to see or feel anything. Simply say, Lord, I am here because I love you. And let silence be your sanctuary. Let love be your only proof. Because in that stillness, unseen and uncelebrated, grace is doing its deepest work, the quiet transformation of your soul into the likeness of Christ. If these teachings of Saint Teresa have spoken to your heart, if they've helped you see your prayer life with new clarity and tenderness, then I invite you to stay close to her wisdom. Each week on Timeless Wisdom of Saint Teresa, we walk a little further into the mystery of prayer, learning to discern light from illusion, and to love God not for His gifts but for His presence. So subscribe and continue this journey with us. A journey from emotion to faith, from pride to humility, from shadow to light. And as Teresa promised those who truly seek God in spirit and in truth, the soul that loves without pretending will never lose the way. May that promise become yours. And may every prayer you pray, whether bright or dry, full or empty, lead you ever deeper into the heart of love itself.